Montana Territory, July 1873. The sun was barely over the Absaroka Range when Bridget Zeller sank to her knees in the dry grass behind her cabin, clutching her baby boy to her chest. Her dress was torn at the hem, her eyes raw from sleepless nights, and her husband's grave still hadn't settled. The baby, Jamie, let out a weak cry. She hushed him gently, pressing her lips to his forehead. His cheeks were red from the heat, and her milk had started to dry up 2 days ago. There was no more bread, no more help. Just wind and dust and the echo of her husband's last words. "I'll be back before the week's out." But he had ridden into town to sell their last 2 steers and never returned. Folks said it was pneumonia. Others whispered it had been a fight. Bridget never asked. What mattered was that he was gone. She had stayed on the land, hoping someone would come, anyone. But out here, 10 miles past the last ranch fence, no one came unless they meant to until that morning. She heard the horse before she saw him. The steady thump of hooves in dry earth, the jingle of tack. She rose slowly, shielding Jamie from the sun with her shawl, heart thudding hard in her chest. The man rode in from the east, tall in the saddle, a rifle slung behind him and dust clinging to his coat. He pulled up when he saw her, bringing the horse to a stop with an easy hand. "You all right, ma'am?" His voice was calm, deep, and edged with concern. Bridget stood straight, squinting against the light. "Do I look all right?" The man dismounted. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with shaggy dark hair and tired eyes. His shirt was worn, his boots scuffed, but there was something solid in the way he moved. "No, you do not," he said honestly. "Name's Rhett Fallen. I was headed west, stopped to water my horse, and saw smoke from your chimney." Bridget's voice cracked. "There's no fire." "Been out 2 days." He looked past her toward the quiet cabin and then down at Jamie, who had gone quiet in her arms. "That your boy?" She nodded, jaw tight. "Jamie, he's 3 months." Rhett took off his hat, rubbed the back of his neck. "You alone out here? My husband died 4 weeks ago." She said it flat. No tears, just the truth. Rhett didn't flinch. He looked at the baby again, then back to her. "You got food?" She shook her head. "I got some in my saddlebags. Dried beef, cornmeal." "Water, too." Bridget hesitated, but Jamie shifted in her arms, weak and feverish. She stepped back and opened the cabin door without a word. Inside, the place was dark and still. The cradle was by the hearth, empty. A tin cup lay on its side near the cold stove. Rhett followed her in, setting the food down on the table. He moved quiet, respectful, not looking too long at anything. Bridget laid Jamie in the cradle and ran a palm over his fine hair. "You stayed," she said after a moment. "Most men would have turned around. I was not raised that way." Rhett poured water into a tin cup and offered it to her. "You need to drink." She took it, hands trembling slightly. He leaned against the wall, watching her with a kind of quiet focus. "You got any family back in Missouri?" "But I cannot leave. This land was my husband's, ours, Jamie's. I will not abandon it." Rhett nodded once. "Then we will find a way." Bridget blinked. He shrugged one shoulder. "You need help. I can spare a few weeks. I have no place to be." She stared at him. "You do not know me." "I know enough," he said. "You are trying to hold on. That is worth standing beside." The words hit harder than she expected. Bridget turned away, swallowing the knot in her throat. "I do not expect charity." "I am not offering charity," he said firmly. "I am offering to fix your roof, hunt you some meat, and keep you and that baby safe while you figure things out." She looked at him then, really looked. His eyes were steady and serious. He meant it. "Why?" she asked. Rhett hesitated. "Because no woman should be left alone with a baby in the middle of nowhere. Because I got a mother back east who would slap me upside the head if I rode past without stopping." That made her smile, faint but real. He smiled too, but just a little. "I will sleep in the barn." She nodded. "All right." He left her then, stepping outside into the heat, and she stood alone in the silence of the cabin, heart still racing. She looked down at Jamie, who stirred and blinked up at her. "I think we just met a good man," she whispered. That night, Rhett lit a fire in the hearth and cooked up some of the dried beef into a stew. Jamie drank goat's milk he had bartered for on the road, and Bridget ate more than she had in days. They did not talk much, but there was a calm in the air she had not felt since before her husband died. When the baby cried just after midnight, Bridget rocked him by the fire. Rhett sat across the room, polishing his rifle by lamplight. "He looks like you," Rhett said softly. Bridget looked down at Jamie. "He has his father's eyes." Rhett nodded slowly. "Still, he is lucky. He has you." She did not answer, but when she looked up, her eyes met his. And for a long moment, neither of them looked away. By the end of the week, Rhett had patched the roof, cleared the well, and shot a deer that would last them through the month. He made her laugh once, truly laugh, when he tried to chase a chicken into the coop and ended up flat in the dirt, feathers flying. He never touched her, never asked for anything. But he was always there, splitting wood, feeding Jamie, mending tools, and each day, the silence between them filled with something warmer. One evening, as the sky turned amber and Jamie slept in the cradle, she found Rhett outside watching the horizon. "You could leave any time," she said quietly. He looked over his shoulder. "I know, but you have not." He stepped closer. "Do you want me to?" She hesitated. Then, voice soft, "No." Rhett's gaze moved across her face, slow and careful. "Bridget, I ain't trying to replace what you lost, but I could stay, not just for now, for good. Be your husband, be Jamie's father." Her breath caught. "You mean that?" "I do." She looked down, one hand over her heart. "I did not think I would ever feel safe again." He stepped closer still, placing a hand gently on her arm. "Let me give you that." And she leaned into him, just enough for her cheek to rest against his chest. His arms wrapped around her, strong and sure. For the first time in weeks, she closed her eyes and breathed easy. The girl had been left alone with her baby until a cowboy named Rhett Fallon said he would be father and husband too. The first real rain came 6 days after Rhett said he would stay. It rolled in slow from the west, heavy with the scent of sage and wet earth. Bridget stood on the porch with Jamie swaddled close, watching the clouds bend low over the hills. Rhett had gone out to gather firewood before the storm set in, and the baby slept soundly against her shoulder, his small breath warm through the muslin. He returned just as the first drops tapped the sod roof, his shirt damp and his hair darker from the wet. Without a word, he set the wood beneath the overhang and opened the door for her to go in ahead. "You feel it," he said once they'd stepped inside, his voice low so as not to wake the baby. "The land breathing again." Bridget nodded, tucking a damp strand of hair behind her ear. "I was starting to forget the smell. Everything's been so dry." Rhett set the kettle on the hook over the fire and crouched to stir the coals. "Ground's been waiting longer than you have, I reckon." She unwrapped Jamie and settled him in the cradle. The fire cracked gently, sending up the scent of hickory. Bridget moved to the table and began cutting the last of the carrots Rhett had traded for in town 3 days earlier. He watched her hands for a moment before saying, "That man who sold me these, he knew your husband." Bridget paused, the knife hovering over the chopping block. "What did he say?" "Only that he came in quiet, sold those 2 steers fair, and left with a bottle he didn't have when he came in." Her jaw tightened, but she went back to slicing. "He used to be steady, until the second winter." Rhett didn't press. He stood and moved to the window, watching the rain bead on the glass. "I'm not asking to take his place, just want to build something new." Bridget didn't answer right away. She poured the carrots into the pot and stirred slowly, her eyes on the swirl of broth. "I don't want Jamie to grow up wondering if he's a burden." "He won't," Rhett said, turning from the window. "Not while I got breath in me." Later, with supper warming their bellies and the storm softening to a steady patter, Bridget handed him a folded scrap of paper. "I wrote to my sister. She's in Colombia, married to a doctor. I told her I was all right." "Was that true?" Rhett asked. She looked at him, her eyes clear. "It is now." The next morning the ground steamed in the sun and the world smelled clean. Rhett hitched the wagon and asked if she'd ride with him to the creek's bend, where he'd seen wild mint growing. She hesitated, glancing at Jamie. "I can't leave him alone." "I'll bring the cradle," he said. "Wheels'll hold." "We'll go slow." She watched him lift the cradle into the wagon bed with the same care he gave to saddling his horse. Jamie stirred only once during the ride, lulled by the rhythm of the wheels and the sound of Rhett's voice humming low. At the creek, the grass came up past their knees, and the mint spread like a green ribbon along the water. Bridget stepped down barefoot, the hem of her dress brushing the wet earth. She bent to gather the leaves, and Rhett watched her without speaking, as if the moment itself might vanish if he did. She straightened and found him closer than before. "What would you have done if I'd said no?" she asked. His brow furrowed slightly. "I'd have left. Not proud of it. But I wouldn't have stayed where I wasn't wanted." "I never said I didn't want you," she said, voice quieter than the rustle of the leaves. "No," he said, "but you weren't ready to say you did." Bridget looked down at the bundle in her hands, then toward the cradle in the wagon bed. Jamie was awake now, eyes wide and curious. "I'm ready now," she said. Rhett stepped close enough for their shoulders to touch. "Then let me build you a house that doesn't leak, a life that doesn't frighten you." She turned to him. "And if it rains again?" "Then we'll be warm together," he said, and reached for her hand. Her fingers laced with his without hesitation. The girl who'd been left with nothing but land and a baby now had a hand to hold, and a man who had asked for nothing but the chance to stay. By late August, the high grass turned gold and brittle, and the cottonwoods along the creek started to yellow at their edges. Bridget stood barefoot in the garden rows behind the cabin, her skirts damp from morning dew, as she pulled late squash from the vine. Jamie lay swaddled in a basket beside her, shaded by a patched cloth Rhett had tacked to 2 stakes. He kicked his feet lazily, his eyes following the leaves overhead. Across the clearing, Rhett was splitting a felled pine into boards, the steady rhythm of his axe keeping time with the wind. He'd built a rough frame for a chicken coop the week before, and now he was clearing space beside the barn for more pens. The land had started to shift beneath their hands, more orderly, more lived in. Bridget brushed dirt from her palms and wiped sweat from her brow. "You plan to keep working through winter?" Rhett straightened, leaning on the axe. "Figure it's easier now than when the ground's frozen." She walked over, basket in hand. "You've already done more than most men would." He looked at her then, his face flushed from the sun. "I'm not most men." "No," she said. "You're not." He lowered the axe slowly. "I was thinking if you're willing we could build a smokehouse, dry some meat right, maybe even trade some come spring." Bridget set the basket down and crossed her arms. "And what would we trade for?" He hesitated. "I saw a piano in town. Old but sound. Could use tuning." She blinked, caught off guard. "Piano, you said you used to play. Thought maybe Jamie should grow up hearing it." She turned away for a moment, her throat tightening. "I haven't touched keys in years." "Doesn't mean you forgot how." Bridget reached down and picked up a split log, setting it beside the others. "You remember everything I say, only the parts that matter." She knelt to stack the rest, hiding the way her hands trembled. After a long silence, she asked, "You ever plan to send word to your people?" Rhett bent to help her. "My father died before I turned 20. Mama's still in Kansas with my sister. She's got her own hands full. I'll write her, though. Let her know where I landed." Bridget glanced sideways at him. You think she'll be glad? She'll ask if you're decent. Then she'll send a quilt and start praying for your patience." Bridget smiled faintly. "Sounds like a woman who knows her son too well." He stood, brushing sawdust from his trousers. "I've been thinking we ought to go into town. Get your name on the land deed." Bridget straightened. "It's in his name. Doesn't need to stay that way." He met her gaze squarely. "You're the one tending it." She studied him, uncertain. "And yours?" He reached for her hand, rough fingers brushing her wrist. "Only if you want it there." The weight of the words settled on her chest, not heavy but sure. She looked toward the cabin, toward her sleeping son. "What would we say when folks ask who we are to each other?" Rhett held her gaze. "I'd say you're my wife." She didn't flinch. "And I'd say you're the man who kept his word." That Sunday, they rode into town before the sun crested the ridge. Rhett held Jamie in one arm while Bridget signed her name beside his in the county ledger. The clerk looked between them, then down at the baby and said nothing but, "Congratulations." They left with flour, a roll of cloth, and a tin of peppermint drops that Rhett claimed were for the boy, though Bridget caught him sneaking one on the ride back. That night, with Jamie asleep between them on a blanket near the hearth, Bridget leaned her head against Rhett's shoulder. "I don't know how to feel happy," she whispered. "Not yet." "You don't have to," he said. "You just have to let it grow." She turned her face into his sleeve. "Promise me something, anything. When Jamie's grown and he asks how it all began, you'll tell him I chose you, not because I had to, because I wanted to." Rhett shifted, wrapping his arm around her. "He'll know. Just by the way you look at me." The girl who had once stood in dust and silence now shared soft evenings with a man who had asked for no part of her past, only her future. The first frost came early that year, dusting the fence rails in white before the leaves had fully turned. Bridget stood at the edge of the field with her shawl drawn tight, watching Rhett and the neighbor boy Thomas, barely 16, work the plow through the last of the soil. Rhett had hired him in exchange for a pair of boots and a promise of supper, and the boy had shown up before dawn, eager and quiet. Bridget shifted Jamie on her hip, his breath warm against her collarbone. He'd begun to teethe, fussing more than usual, and she hadn't slept longer than an hour at a stretch in days. Still, her eyes stayed on Rhett, who moved with the same quiet resolve he always had, sleeves rolled, hands firm on the plow handles. When he finally unhitched the mule, Bridget met him at the barn door. "You'll wear yourself down," she said softly. He glanced at her hands, pale from the cold. "You're one to talk." She half laughed, brushing hay from Jamie's blanket. "I've learned to work tired." Rhett leaned against the stall gate. "I was thinking, that corner near the oak grove might be good ground for an orchard." She raised an eyebrow. "You planning to live here long enough for trees to bear fruit?" "I'm planning to grow old here," he said simply. "If that's what you want to." Bridget looked past him, to the ridge where the sun had begun to sink behind the bare cottonwoods. "I never thought that far ahead before." He stepped closer. "Then maybe we start small, plant one tree, see how it does." She looked up at him, her voice quiet. "What kind?" "Peach." He smiled faintly. "They take patience. But they're worth it." Back in the cabin, Jamie finally slept after a long, fretful spell, and Bridget sat cross-legged on the floor, mending one of Rhett's shirts. The fire burned low, filling the room with a gentle warmth, and the kettle hissed softly over the coals. Rhett came in from washing up, his hair damp, stubble darker along his jaw. He crouched beside her, watching her stitch with measured precision. "You always mend by hand?" he asked. "I never had another way." He reached for the thread spool. "My sister used to sew with a treadle machine. We'd pump the pedal for her when she got tired. She said it made her feel like she was running the house, not just keeping it." Bridget didn't look up. "Do you miss her?" "Every now and again." She was loud, opinionated. He smiled slightly. You'd have liked her. She tied off the last stitch and set the shirt aside. I think I forget how to talk to women sometimes. You talk just fine. Bridget's fingers lingered over the fabric. I used to be sharper before the baby, quicker. Now my thoughts come slow. He sat beside her, knees brushing. You're raising a child. That ain't slow, it's steady. She turned to him. You sure you want to hitch yourself to all this? I already have. I just haven't said the words out loud yet. She folded her hands in her lap. Then say them. He reached into his coat and pulled out a ring, simple and narrow, the silver dulled with age. It was my mother's. She gave it to me the day I left home. Said it wasn't meant to sit in a drawer. Bridget stared at the band, then at him. You think we need a preacher? I think we need honesty. And the will to stand beside each other when things get hard. That's enough for me. She took the ring, turning it between her fingers, then slid it onto her hand. It fit, as if it had always belonged there. Rhett let out a soft breath. We'll tell Thomas tomorrow. He can serve as witness. I'll carve us a cross for the mantle. Bridget nodded, her voice low. Then we're married. He leaned in, resting his forehead against hers. Then we're married. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of split pine and cold earth. Inside, Bridget reached for him as if she'd always known where he'd be. And in that quiet space, with firelight dancing across the walls and Jamie breathing easy in the cradle, they held each other like the beginning of something they both believed in. By late September, the wind had shifted again, cooler now, with the scent of pine bark and damp soil. Bridget stood near the edge of the field with her arms crossed over her shawl, watching as Rhett finished smoothing the last of the lime wash across the cabin's west wall. The boards gleamed pale in the morning light, newly sealed against the coming cold. I didn't think the place could look like this, she said, her voice low, shaded with something that wasn't quite disbelief. Rhett stepped back from the wall, wiping his hands on a rag looped through his belt. Didn't think or didn't hope. She looked down at her boots, the worn toes dusted white. Both. Rhett didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked to the trough, dipped the rag in the water, and wrung it out slow. Behind him, the barn door hung open on its new iron hinges, the smell of fresh hay drifting out. Bridget had helped him pack it tight 2 days prior, her back sore by nightfall but her head clear in a way it hadn't been in years. He turned toward her, water dripping from his fingers. You ever think about what Jamie might become spring when he's walking? She blinked, caught by the question. No, I've only thought as far as his next tooth. He's got your eyes, Rhett said. He'll see more than we did, I think. Bridget tipped her head slightly. You always talk like the future's already planted. It is, he said. We're just waiting on the bloom. That afternoon, Bridget took Jamie wrapped in wool and walked the long path to the ridge. Rhett stayed behind to finish shoring the east fence, though he'd offered to go with her. She'd told him she needed the walk alone. He hadn't argued. She reached the ridge as the sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the valley below. The wind tugged at her skirt and Jamie stirred against her chest. This was his land once, she whispered. Not to Jamie, not even to the wind. Just to the place. But it's ours now. She sat on a flat stone and let Jamie stretch his legs, his hands grasping at dry blades of grass. The land was quiet but not empty. There were deer trails where none had been last year. Birdsong still lingered in the distance. And near the bottom of the slope, the faint outline of the start of an orchard, a single peach sapling Rhett had planted 3 days earlier, its roots tucked deep into the warming soil. When she returned, the cabin smelled of salted pork and wood smoke. Rhett stood at the stove, sleeves rolled, stirring something thick in the pot. You stayed up there a while, he said without turning. I needed to say goodbye, she said. He paused, then glanced over his shoulder. To him, to the woman I was with him. Rhett nodded once and handed her a bowl. Then maybe you're ready for what comes next. That night, after Jamie had drifted off and the fire had burned low, Bridget laid the ledger book on the table. She set the ink beside it, opened it to a fresh page and dipped the pen. "What's that for?" Rhett asked from the rocking chair, eyes on her face. "A record," she said. "For Jamie, so he'll know how we began." He leaned forward. "You want me to write some?" She shook her head. "I want you to tell me." "I'll write it in my hand." He stood, walked to her side and rested his hand lightly on her back. "Then start with this. A man came riding west and found a woman holding the line alone, and he decided she was worth holding it with." She wrote the words down, slow and careful. By the end of October, the first snow fell light and quick, melting by midday but enough to tell them what was coming. Rhett moved the cradle closer to the hearth, and Bridget began sewing a quilt from old shirts and scraps of muslin, her stitches even and sure. One morning, Rhett returned from the barn with a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He laid it on the table, untied the cord, and folded it back. Inside sat a small cedar box, plainly carved, the lid smooth from sanding. Bridget looked at it, then up at him. "I figured," he said, "if we're a family, we ought to have a place to keep things that matter." She opened it and ran her fingers along the inside. "Like what letters?" he said. "A baby tooth, a dried flower, whatever we don't want forgotten." She set the box gently beside the ledger. That evening they stood outside beneath a sky sharp with stars. Jamie slept inside, the windows shuttered against the wind. Bridget leaned into Rhett's side. "Do you ever miss the road?" He wrapped his arm around her waist. "Not once since the day I stopped." She looked up at him. "You really think this life will hold?" "I think we will," he said. And she believed him. They married again in the spring, proper this time, under the cottonwoods with only Thomas and his mother as witnesses. Rhett wore a clean shirt Bridget had sewn him through the winter. Jamie toddled through the grass, his cheeks pink from sun and laughter. Bridget wore a ribbon in her hair. The days ran long after that, in the way that only happens when work is steady and love is quiet but sure. The orchard grew one tree at a time. The smokehouse filled. And on warm evenings, Bridget played scales on the old piano Rhett had traded for in town, while Jamie fell asleep on the rug and Rhett sat nearby, whittling peachwood into toys with his pocket knife. Years passed. They added a second room to the cabin. A second child followed, a girl with Rhett's dark hair and Bridget's stillness. Jamie grew strong, steady with his hands and always humming the songs his mother played. The land never gave much more than it had to, but it gave enough. And Bridget, once alone with nothing but a patch of earth and a child in her arms, never spent another night waiting on a rider who would not return. Because the man who stayed had never once looked back.